this. There we go. This week, the Toledo Chamber is partnering with innovative business and community leaders from across the region to provide valuable tools and resources to help our members attract, retain, and develop their workforces. Today's topic is Employee Resource Group Best Practices. Owens Corning believes in making sure people can use their true self at work, can be their true self at work. Employee resource groups, also known as affinity groups, bring this idea to life in multiple ways and build a more inclusive and emotionally intelligent culture. These groups, including the African American Resource Group, Outreach, Women's Inclusion Network, and Interfaith Exchange, raise awareness around the communities each serves. Today, we're going to learn more from our partners at Owens Corning as they share some of the best practices for creating and managing employee resource groups. This is actually the last session of our Talent Resource Week live sessions, live as you can get via Zoom. But please keep an eye out for a variety of other resources that we will be sharing this week as well in our newsletters, including a new job board, instructions on becoming a featured employer on the Toledo Region website, and more. We're really excited about this afternoon session, and I just want to take a quick moment to recognize some of our sponsors for this week. Our gold sponsor this week is Buckeye Broadband. Our silver sponsor is Associated General Contractors of Northwest Ohio, and our bronze sponsor is the Lucas County Department of Planning and Development. We couldn't put on these types of events without help from our sponsors, so we really appreciate their support. A few things as it relates to Zoom. So I know that this conversation is going to be very interactive, but if everyone could mute themselves, if you're not speaking, so that'll make it easier for all of us to enjoy this presentation. If you have questions during the session, please put those in the chat box. You can find that along the bottom of your toolbar. We might answer some of those questions as we're going through, but it'll be nice and something that we can come back to later and make sure that all questions are answered. The other thing that's really helpful that we've found in the sessions this week is to make sure that you are on speaker view rather than gallery view. Gallery gives us that Brady Bunch look, but speaker view will help as individual panelists are speaking, you'll be able to tell who that person is. And if there are any slides during the presentation, you can move the arrows back and forth so that you can see more presenter or you can see more presentation. And that is all that I have from a housekeeping perspective. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Houston Young is the Inclusion, Diversity, and Community Outreach Leader at Owens Corning. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Houston. Thanks for being here today. And I'll let you introduce the panelists.
Okay. Well, and thank you, Jeff. And I want to thank you, Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce and the Talent and Workforce team. So I got that right.
You did, thank you.
Want to really thank you guys. This is quite an honor for us as a team from Owens Corning. We love Toledo. As you know, this is where we planted our roots, and we really believe that in a lot of respects that we are all in this together. So thank you very much. And Jeff, thank you for that invitation. Now, I just want to start and say that when you think about 2020, this year, it's just been an unprecedented year. I was just sharing with some friends over the past weekend. We finally got a chance to get together, and I just described this year as like I go down deep into the water and I come up for breath, and I go back down and I come back up, and we shared a lot of pain as we've been impacted both personally, professionally. And even when we want to connect, like we come to work, it's been even difficult. We have to do that virtually. So in that backdrop, if you will, what we're going to be talking about today around affinity groups and the role of affinity groups, this is a really, timely discussion for us. So I do encourage you, the way it's really set up, we want to have a good interaction. We want this to be value added for you. We've learned a lot of lessons over our journey. Affinity groups at Owens Corning has been around for a long time. I'm here in 20 plus years. But there has been some significant changes that we were undertaking over the last couple years, and it really, came to a head in a climate that we face today. So so let me share with you. I'm going to have the panel come up before in just a moment if I can. So here's what I want you to kind of expect. What we're going to do, I'm going to ask some panelists some questions, and they're going to share their heart. We are going to be transparent. We're going to be visible. We're going to give it to you from our heart. And so I brought some great leaders. Not only are they leaders of affinity groups, but they are leaders in their own right in their day-to-day functions. So I'm going to thank them too. You're going to hear from them in just a moment. And a little bit more about my background before we go too far. I've been with Owens Corning for 2.5 years. And as Jeff has mentioned, I serve as the community outreach leader. I work for the VP of Inclusion and Diversity, Leah McGuire. And this is actually a new role, and it kind of speaks to the investment that Owens Corning is making in this space. So Jeff, if you will, if you could go to a couple of slides, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of Owens Corning, a little bit about our affinity groups, and then we're going to get right into the panel discussion. So Jeff, if you could go to the next slide there. And I did leave that up for Jeff because I left all the technology his way.
Sorry, I had it there, but switching over, it didn't want to go to it right away.
No worries.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Okay, so what we can do is let's go to the next slide. I do want to point that that comment of achieving growth through inclusion. When you ask the question at Owens Corning, you say, well, what is your core belief? What do you believe? And we have a statement here. We're looking to really build a culture of appreciation. We have a foundational belief at OC that when you start with appreciation and you have a high degree of appreciation in everything you do from your leadership behaviors, leads to high inclusion. And for our employees, we believe that that leads to high engagement. And having high engaged employees, they're performing at their best. That leads to high performing teams, which lends to great outcomes. So at the core for us, inclusion is what we do. And these are going to be some outcomes that we expect to see. Next slide. So, and you can go to the next. So I'm going to give you where I think was a really pivotal moment for us over the last couple of years. And it's just coincidentally, like I had a 28-year career in automotive prior to coming to Owens Corning. So when I joined, there were all kind of actions around the inclusion and diversity space. And I just saw just a transformation even in a short period of time I was there. If you ask a lot of employees inside, they will tell you, we've had affinity groups for a while. Our CEO leaned in and we signed this CEO action for diversity and inclusion, a pledge. Maybe some of your companies have already joined the pledge. If you haven't, I would encourage you to really talk to your leadership, talk to team members about doing so. There's a lot of great best practices in this vein, and it really opens up the conversation. I like to, if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to share a personal story that I think will sum this up. So late in 2018, back in December, as part of the pledge, Owens Corning leaned into what we call a day of understanding. Today we call it courageous conversations. One of the AARG members actually asked me, hey, you should go and attend. I was like, I heard a little bit about it. She said, you really should go. I attended, and it was anonymous in terms of how you signed up. You didn't know who was going to be in there. So I went in there, and lo and behold, at the time it was the COO. He was in there. His name is Brian Chambers, and he kicks it off. And I'm sitting there with a lot of folks. I've had great diversity around the room. And he leans in and he says, you know, for many of you with what's going on in our society, he says, we realize that these things are impacting us and we're bringing them inside Owens Corning. And it's important that we have a forum and a way of actually talking about this. He then talked about some of the, you know, social tensions that were going on. And he says, I came from a position of privilege and I have never walked in your shoes. I want to hear your stories. He showed this transparency and this vulnerability. And I got to tell you, I stepped back and said, wow, I have never heard those words in my 28 prior years. We went around the table and the discussions that came out of that was phenomenal, touched our hearts. There was a lot of emotion. I shared my stories as well. And when we came out of that, he and I were chatting and he said, you know, really touched by this. What do you think? I said, where do you think we go from here? I said, you know, Brian, being honest, this has gone so far from a company that I have been a part of and probably many of my colleagues. I think we're in uncharted territory. We just figure this out together. I did encourage him, hey, I think have the group again in a couple months and let's see where we go from there. Well, what happened was between the end of that year to the next, he became the CEO. And he held that same group together. But this time he says, this is where I want to make my stamp. And I'm going to have a VP, a role that's going to spend day in and out focused on that, just so that we make sure we move the needle faster. That person's actually on the phone today. From there, there's just been a series of events. And what we're going to be talking about today is the role of the affinity groups and how they played into that. And in that story, you can see the importance of having your senior leaders engaged in that and their commitment. That's one point that I just wanted to make out of the story I shared with you. So with that, enough of me talking. That's just my intro. Let's get to some panel discussion and let's hear from some of the key panelists. So if you can go to the next slide there. We have three distinguished guests, Clyde, Scott, and Jenna, and I'm going to let them actually introduce themselves and share a little bit about their stories, but I got a question for them. So we'll kick it off this way. We're actually going to talk, let's start at the top and let's talk about, you know, the business case imperative, like why inclusion and diversity is important and the role of the affinity groups. So, so here's my question for you panelists. What does the inclusion and diversity mean to you, and what role does affinity groups serve in the organization? Hey, Clyde, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Again, Clyde Calhoun. I lead marketing efforts for our appliance installation business. I've been with Owens Corning now for about 17 years, but I've been involved with affinity groups for probably since the mid-90s with the prior company. I think for me, a couple things, and inclusion is that key part of the inclusion and diversity, because it's one thing to have diversity, meaning you've got kind of the numbers there, but it's another thing to actually be heard. And for me, that's why the inclusion piece is so important, is that you're not only there, but you're also being heard and involved in the conversation. And that makes a world of difference. You know, when I think about affinity groups and how they've evolved at Owens Corning, I can go back to my early days at OC. And I actually think affinity groups at that time were really all about, you know, connecting diverse populations together. So it was a place where you connect, feel supported, kind of build that relationship. And I think we've evolved from there to just being a hub for connection, to really being advocates for change and trying to drive change. But where I think we've gone in these last few years, and what I'm probably most excited about, is not only are we driving change ourselves, but we're also catalysts for change. And the big difference that I'll say with that part is, you know, when you're driving change, it feels like you're doing it all yourself. And I think the reality that, again, as I think about our African American Affinity group, is that we can't do it alone. It really takes the entire community of folks at OC, regardless of whether you're diverse or not, to really get the level of change that we're driving. So that I think is an important part of the evolution that we've had, and why I'm so very excited about where we've landed now with all of the focus on inclusion and diversity.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And you've been at this for a while, Clyde. So you have seen many phases of this, and I think that I share the same thing. Some experiences where, you know, this was not always above ground when you tried to connect, and it wasn't always comfortable when you even met as a collective group. So thank you for sharing. So let's go to Jana. Jana, how about you sharing your story too?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jana Utzi. I'm the global category leader for MRO in our indirect sourcing group. I've been with Owens Corning for just about 13 years. And I co-lead our Women's Inclusion Network, or WIN. So I think just thinking about like my evolution with WIN and my involvement, I started as a member and used it. You know, somebody had mentioned, hey, there's this WIN group at Owens Corning, and I thought, oh, I'll join it, and you know, it'll be a way to network. You know, much to what Clyde talked about, you know, being a forum for connection. As I, you know, got more acquainted with some of the events that they were having, just wanted to get more involved. I heard from several leaders and peers that were working moms, or, you know, women essentially that I kind of thought like, they have it all together, they have it figured out. But then I heard through some of these events like, wait, they have some of the same challenges and, you know, frustrations that I have. And so I took an opportunity to join the board to help plan some of the events. And then now that's just morphed into being a part of the WIN leadership team. And so I think for me, what, you know, much to what Clyde said, you know, it very much is a forum for connecting and networking and reaching people that you may not otherwise reach in your day-to-day. But where we're going now is really driving kind of like awareness, and we talk a lot about allyship. So we've even had conversations recently on like, we should have male members a part of our Women's Inclusion Network, because we want them to be advocates for us as well, and to hear what some of the challenges are. Because, you know, if you stay kind of within your own affinity group, it's great to understand what the challenges are, but if it's not reaching outside of that group, what difference are we making? So I think, you know, it's similar to what Clyde has said. Now we're really advocating for that change and being a part of it versus, you know, just being a forum for connection. So I think that's what's most encouraging for me. And, you know, what I'm really excited about is I think about where we're going with our affinity groups and with our inclusion and diversity initiatives.
Wow. Thank you, Jana, for sharing that, and leaning in, you know, with someone that doesn't necessarily fit the profile, if you will, and demographics of the group. That we're actually going to come and talk about that a little bit more. So, but I first want to hear from Scott. So Scott, why don't you share your
Sure.
story and your view
Great.
on this as well?
Thanks, Houston, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm Scott Munch. I work in our Toledo office as well as a logistics manager. Been with the company a little over 4 years now, so started right out of college. And my involvement in inclusion and diversity at the company has been a bit of a journey. So really leaning into kind of the emotional piece behind a lot of this is, you know, I was an intern the year marriage equality was passed. I felt very isolated that day. I wasn't out at work. It wasn't something that I felt comfortable sharing with my employees and colleagues. I then went down to one of our manufacturing facilities in South Carolina for a year. I didn't feel super comfortable coming out in that environment. And then I made a conscious decision when I moved back to Toledo to say, nope, I'm coming out at work. This is something that, you know, this is a part of who I am. I'm very out in my personal life, but I need to feel comfortable doing that in my professional life too. And Owens Corning has allowed me to do that through the ERG or affinity groups that we have here. So similar to what Jana said, you know, started as just a general member of our outreach affinity group. It's our affinity group for LGBTQ plus and allies. And then that led me to being on our steering team and then led me to being a co-leader. So I now co-lead that group. It's just been an amazing transformation from being you know, really a college student who was very worried about my career to coming into an organization that has sat down, had that CEO for action, and said, this is, you know, the type of organization we're going to be. We're going to allow our employees to bring our full selves to work every single day. And we're going to really let them drive that change. So OC allowing me to be a part of one of these groups has just been really empowering. And I think really is truly the reason I continue to wake up every single day and be excited to go into work. Not that I don't love logistics, but some days it can be a bit monotonous. But the, you know, ability to connect with others on IND work has really, you know, kept me motivated to be here. So that's my story.
Hey, that's a wonderful story. And it leads me to this one question. And I want you guys to talk a little bit because you touched on it. I think it's appropriate that we talk about this. And Jana, you mentioned that, hey, it's just women may attend the WINS group, and at some point, you said, hey, we need to invite someone that doesn't look like us. I want you to lean into that, share a little bit about that, and share a little bit about their uncomfortability. Because I actually worked for someone that went to the WIN group, and I heard a couple stories. So why don't you share and let's talk about that.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, I think very much as we started these affinity groups, it was, you know, you had these people who still sort of looked like each other or had similar attributes that, you know, came together, and it was a way to connect and maybe a way to voice concerns or frustrations or challenges that they were facing. But really, as we looked at from a win standpoint, what we wanted the team to accomplish and what we wanted the group to accomplish, we really started going more down a path of, you know, development and, you know, really making sure that we were providing the right opportunities for women. But with that, we needed partners in that, right? Like we need, you know, if we look at who makes up the majority of our leaders, more times than not, it's, you know, it's a man. And so it's important to have that connection so that we're, you know, getting that allyship from our male leaders, and that's something that's become a common theme around this, you know, this term allyship or advocacy, because without that, sorry, my dog's gonna go crazy here, of course.
No worries.
Without that, you know, we're not making progress. And we did have, so I don't know if this is what you're speaking about,
Yes.
Houston, but I know that one of our VPs of finance had decided that he wanted to attend a WIN event because it was part of his inclusion goals and objectives that he really wanted to have more awareness and become more involved. And so he came to a WIN event, and he was the only man there. And, you know, he was like, I feel really uncomfortable. And he was like, it was really eye-opening for him because he's like, is this what like women or, you know, anybody else feels when they walk into a room full of men? Like, because that was the first time he had ever experienced that, where he was the one that was not like the others. So I thought that was really, you know, really interesting. And that's really what kicked off, you know, us thinking about this differently, is that this is a women's inclusion network. That doesn't mean that only women should be members. We should have all kinds of members, because that's how we create, you know, the connection, the awareness, and we really drive that forward progress.
Wow. Well said. Clyde, you or Scott, let's lean into this. What's been your experience with allyship and expanding, going from just a group that connects to a group that's really understanding
Sure.
each other and adding value to each other?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, oh, Clyde, you
Oh,
go
go
ahead
ahead,
and
Scott.
then, all right, I'll take this one then. And then you can give your perspective. Definitely want to hear it from your side of things. I think allyship, in the LGBT community has been an integral part of, just the general equality movement and push towards, equal rights for gay people, right? So I think a lot of people are familiar with the term allyship in that context. So it's definitely been something we have relied on in our ERG from the very beginning. Our ERG started back in the 90s. I won't tell you where I was in the 90s, but it was elementary school. So I was not here when that happened, but the story has since been passed down that our first meeting for our LGBT, affinity group was actually in someone's home. It was in someone's living room because employees did not feel comfortable enough coming to work and walking into a room that was for this LGBT, connection group, if you will. And from my understanding, really what allowed that group to then transition into in-person meetings was the allies. It was a group of individuals that said, even though I'm straight or heterosexual or don't identify with the LGBT community, I'm going to come here, create a safe space, and allow everybody to be a part of this group, no matter who you are. And so it really has just created a sense of community amongst the group, because I myself, as a gay person, don't always have to feel like, I'm the only one that's leading this cause. I would say probably right now, 60 to 70% of our our affinity group are actually straight allies, which is incredible. Me and my co-lead talk all the time. How do we get more, LGBT people involved in our LGBT resource group? So allyship is just so important and driving that change, because as a lot of marginalized groups know, sometimes it can just get very overwhelming. And you get tired from the media and everything going on, and sometimes it's a lot easier for someone who's an ally to come in and say, hey, let me take the reins and lead the charge a little bit.
Well, thank you.
And I think I'm just going to build on that a little bit. And again, Scott, I think that was a nice lead in, because I think the LGBT group has really been at the forefront of allyship. And I know from an African American resource group perspective, I've learned a lot about what allyship really means and how that works. And I think that really just goes to the power of the collaboration across the affinity groups. And there's just that learning process as each group kind of understands what's happening, things that we can pick up on that will allow us to advance inclusion and diversity together. And that I think is very important. Not to mention that there's also the crossover that between the groups in any event, whether you're a Black woman or whether you're gay and African American, all those things kind of tie in, together. And so it makes sense that we would have that level of collaboration there. I think the other thing, and Jana kind of touched on this earlier too, just having that diversity within the group is also very important from the standpoint of getting different ideas in the room. I know there have been times with our African American resource group, which includes white people as well, that someone would say, hey, that may not really have the impact that you're looking for it to have, and just again having all those different voices together creates outcomes that are more powerful. So I just think that it ties well together, and whether we're talking about allyship or whether we're talking about other things that we want to do as groups, that part's important.
Okay. Let's pause from our group. Jeff, are there any questions that anyone has from the chat box or would like to ask?
I don't see anything in the chat box right now, but I would just like to share that I was the only man at a women's event that the Ohio Diversity Council put on a few years ago. And I walked in and Actually, I shouldn't say I was the only. The other person was the director for the Ohio Diversity Council. He had to be there. And so it was a unique situation. And when asked why I was there, it was because I want to be an ally. And I can't be an ally if I don't know the other side of the story. I know what my experience is, and I know what my perception is, and how can I better learn how to work with the other women in my office, work with my clients who are women, if I don't understand their perspective. So I thought that was a really good point when you say we want people who are not necessarily like us to be able to come in and learn more about it. So
Yeah.
I had one other question. You have 4 or 5 different groups. What's the average size of each of those groups? Does it fluctuate a lot, or do you try and keep them in to a certain size to make it manageable?
I'll let each speak to that. But I don't think it's one size fits all. And I think and they're all evolving. You know, the recent group that I was actually part of is we have an interfaith exchange group that kicked off, let's say, this year. That started off with a small leadership team of different faiths. So we may have had six different faiths being represented, and that formed a leadership team. And then as we went further out, you know, we'll get to maybe a little bit of this in the structure, then each of them had a community of themselves, and then there were some interconnectivities to those, and then it reaches out to the alliedship and into that. So there's like an evolution, and it seems like every time you take these evolutionary steps, growth comes with it. But I'll pass it over to some of the ones that's been in it for a while. What do you guys say? How about size?
Yeah, I know, like, so WIN is like right around 400 or 500 members. And again, you know, to your point, I think that it has to do a lot with how long we've been around. So we do, like, the majority of our membership base is at the world headquarters, but then we also have members that are at our manufacturing plants or that are at our global locations. And that has been a focus for us, is how do we get beyond the walls of the headquarters where we have more than one location. So we have seen some growth in that regard, but it is still something that we're you know, trying to manage. I think, you know, we have multiple affinity groups, as you know, so that global reach, I think we're figuring out what the best way is to accomplish that, you know, through like one kind of affinity representative or something for that region. But we're around 400 or 500. I think it's somewhat similar for the other affinity groups. I don't know, I'll let Scott and Clyde comment.
Yeah, I think from a African American resource group, yeah, again, similar type overall numbers. I think the thing, as you kind of touched on, you know, we encourage folks to really kind of get together where they are. So there are plants that, hey, there are enough folks there that effectively they're their own chapter. But you know, we don't necessarily think about it in terms of the number. We just encourage everybody to participate. And I would love to say that everyone in our company is a member of the African American Resource Group.
That's right.
Yeah, similar for us.
Okay. I got tons of stories, Jeff. I was almost going to bring up one, but I'm going to hold mine. But just to say the importance of the affinity groups, when we went through the Aubrey shooting, the George Floyd, and the AARG held a session, and we had a president there, let's say white male, and we had a lot of HR folks on the line. And we had the African American community in there sharing stories, and they heard a mouthful, and that meant a lot. What meant even more is, you know, after you have the meeting, let's say it goes an hour, and then everybody's kind of fully expressed exhausted in this, and so then it was like, hey, who wants to just hang around, talk more, right? So what happens is you would think, like in the past, if you weren't really a part of that community, you probably signed out right after that hour, right? That was not the case. And we got to talking about kids and family and all these other things. And it was what I call the afterglow part of that discussion that even meant more. It was like, we are all in this together, not just we're hearing your story, we're in it together. you know, we became family. That's when the family moment. And I think there are moments that matter. And if I was to speak to groups, the moments that matter, this was pivotal. And that took us to another level, because that there were several things that happened with the protest and that happened even afterwards, and it positioned us well, and the company responded in the appropriate way. So I just share that as a nugget as well. So let's talk a little bit now about some lessons learned. I mean, we're getting to this point. Everyone is probably saying, wow, you guys are, seem like you're getting pretty advanced and you're getting integration even amongst groups. But hey, that's not always easy. So let's go around. Clyde, we'll start with you. But what are a few of the most important things to consider? Let's say if you're starting an affinity group in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think Houston, you touched on it in your opening, and actually with a couple of the other examples that are there, just the leadership, connection, in terms of really setting the tone at the top, that inclusion and diversity is an important part of the company and core to the values, and that makes a big difference. I mean, whether it's in our case Brian Chambers or Todd Pfister or other folks that are leaders, creating that space to be able to have difficult conversations at work, to be able to come in again after the George Floyd killing, and to be able to say, hey, I'm really not myself today. This is on my mind. To be able to have that conversation at work, and the space to have that conversation only happens if you get the top-down support for inclusion and diversity. And that's actually part of the evolution that I think we've had as a company, because I remember in my early days at OC, you couldn't always even acknowledge that you were part of a diversity group. I remember several conversations with African Americans that said, hey, I would love to be engaged and involved, but I don't think my manager would like me taking time out of my workday to be able to get some of these diversity initiatives done. And so it may be a challenge at first if you're getting things off the ground. But again, having that top-down support changes the conversation to where people feel comfortable expressing themselves and being actively engaged in inclusion and diversity.
Wow.
And I would just add, I think even more than that, I don't know when this started. I think it's always been in place when I was there, but more than just that leadership support is each of our affinity groups has an executive sponsor. And so on our executive committee, I'm pretty certain that everybody on our executive committee is associated with one of our affinity groups as an executive sponsor and takes a keen interest in being involved in, the programs that we're coming up with, the communications, our goals for the year, things like that. So that executive connection is very important, if for no other reason than to set the tone, but also to kind of pave the way and show that it is okay to be a part of this and to take time out of your day, because it is important. It is an important part of what we do during our workday.
Well, thanks for sharing. Scott, the role you played, where, you really leaned in and look at where the community that you have served are at today, and the allies. So can you talk a little bit about, the importance of, the employee-led perspective? How about you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think OC has really hit the nail on the head with our courageous conversations, or as you mentioned in the beginning, the days of understanding that are now called courageous conversations. But allowing employees to have this voice right now is so powerful. And it's really what has driven our group specifically on, what we want to do. As a leader, of our, affinity group, I'm not going in and saying, okay, here are our goals. We sit down, we say, what's happening in the world that's affecting the LGBT community? What are you feeling? And that has driven kind of our employees to feel engaged and a part of this group and like they're making a difference. And I think that's really what has, at least from when I came into outreach to now, I feel like has allowed us to continue to drive change. So last year, there have been, not to get political, but there have been continued attacks on the transgender community and their rights within the last year or so. And so the big focus this year was, how do we ensure that our trans employees are feeling supported? We found this old document of, a transgender transition guideline that really desperately needed to be updated. So we had a small group of employees working on that. So it's not HR who's leading these discussions, it's the employee that's driving this discussion. And I think it's just so powerful. And I know myself, as a supply chain management degree, never thought I would be driving real actionable change in our policy and procedure within a Fortune 500 company. So that's a good resume builder too.
Wow. No, that's powerful. Well, pause and see if there's any questions to this point. Jeff, you see any questions? If not,
I do not see anything new.
okay. I got another question for you guys relative to, some lessons learned. It seems like we're pretty organized. I know, in fact, we are, but who can talk a little bit about some of the importance of the structure when you're structuring a group and some of the key components that you need to have as to be successful?
I can speak to that a little bit, I think, because I've sort of, I think many of us have kind of evolved through the leadership teams on each of our affinity groups. But I mean, I think it is important. You have to have a smaller subset of leaders over the group, really listening and then driving what the overarching goals and things like that are. To Scott's point, we're not sitting in a room like creating the goals in a vacuum or trying to figure out what everybody's dealing with, but I think remaining connected to the membership base and then really coming together as a smaller group to figure out how we want to prioritize, what are some of those key things that we think we need to address. So from a win standpoint in particular, and let's not mistake that it's a work, right? This is all added work to our normal day job. So it's very important that there's some structure around that so that it's not just a free for all. Otherwise, we wouldn't be moving the needle forward. So from a win standpoint, we're actually to the point where we're wanting to grow that leadership team a bit, because we've had so much involvement from an I&D standpoint and with some of these initiatives, but we have it structured in a way that, there's either a lead or co-leads. And we're actually moving more to this co-lead model where we have kind of alternating 2-year terms. So myself and my colleague, Janet Butler, she's co-leading with me. She will roll off this year and then I'll stay on to kind of continue to co-lead, and we'll bring somebody else from the board up so that we maintain some of that continuity and we're not shifting all the time and having this passing off of the baton, and maybe getting some disruption with that. And then supporting the co-leads, we have several board positions, ranging from like event planning and, kind of content building to chapter coordination and communications. And we've recently added now perspective for women in sales and women in operations, because those are 2 areas that we feel we need to focus on, because we've made progress in terms of women getting into leadership roles at the headquarters in certain functions. But when we look at our manufacturing operations, there's still a lot of challenges with that. It's very male dominated. It's hard for women to, to feel comfortable in those environments and to feel like they have a voice. So that's an area of focus for us. And so we're putting a board position around that. And then I think kind of on top of the structure is making sure that this interaction and this leadership is a part of the individual's goals and objectives. So for me, this is very much a growth and development opportunity for me, to network, to be a leader, to be a part of the change. And it's a part of my annual goals and objectives so that my leader is supportive of it. He knows and understands, why I'm involved with this, what it's helping me to accomplish from a development standpoint. So I think having that structure and then also having that tie back into somebody's goals and objectives is really, really important to make sure that you're getting the right traction.
Wow.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of build on that just a little bit too, because from an African American Resource Group perspective, we're structured in much the same way. But to Jana's point, it is a lot of work. But I think as you're getting started and you're thinking about that motivation for people to step into those roles, that visibility piece that Jana touched on is really important. And I think about affinity groups in one respect that a lot like Motown, from the standpoint of, what Motown did really well is really shine the spotlight and give a forum for folks that weren't allowed to have or didn't get the attention in other settings. And so I think this is one of those times where being involved in a leadership capacity in an affinity group gives you exposure throughout your organization that you wouldn't otherwise have. I know as we kind of trace back folks that have stepped into those roles, that exposure has led to career growth and other opportunities. So I just wanted to put that out there also.
Thank you. We're getting close, Jeff. I got one final question. I do want to ask you guys this. What are some key pitfalls, okay, that you would want to avoid if you're starting and operating an affinity group? So what are some not to do's?
I want to jump in here, Houston.
Okay, go Scott.
So to answer your question with a different answer. So just for those of you that are on the phone that are thinking to yourself, I don't know where to start. This sounds like a lot. Owens Corning's very advanced. I hear you, and I understand where you're coming from. So actually, our group and then the ERG group at Dana partnered together to essentially put together an alliance of LGBTQ plus ERGs in Northwest Ohio. So we have companies like Marathon, University of Toledo for Solar, Cooper Tire, and then Libby and ProMedica are trying to join on here soon. So really what we're doing right now is talking with each other about best practices, about these pitfalls, what challenges we've run into. So if any of you are interested in that space, again, I'm happy. It doesn't even have to be talking about LGBTQ plus issues or starting an ERG in that space. But that's what our group is focused on. But did just want to give a little shameless plug so we can help you start so you don't run into those pitfalls. I think the biggest thing for me that I've seen and we still struggle with today is just understanding that it's, this is all voluntary work. If it doesn't get done, it's not totally the end of the world. Just take a step back, reevaluate, look at your goals, your objectives, but having a very clear outline of your objectives and having a very clear organization strategy, like Jana said, having your co-leads and then your steering team and then your general committee members has allowed my group in the last 2 to 3 years to really, I think, improve from where we've been in the past.
I think too, something else that I would say is I found myself having like unconscious bias about even the women's kind of issues and what people were experiencing. So a lot of the ideas and things that I would come to the table with stemmed around being a working mom. Not everybody in our affinity group is a working mom. There might be some that are retired or empty nesters or early career. And so I think, even though you're a part of an affinity group where everybody has some similar characteristics or attributes, recognizing that even within that, there's going to be different needs, different, kind of events that would appeal to those different demographics. So I think having that awareness and then being careful not to take on too much, right? Like it can be very simple. It can start with, and I think back to some of our earlier events, just a lunch and learn or something to talk about something or watch a TED talk or, it can be very simple where you don't have to have this, huge program in place. But then it kind of evolves from there because you get feedback from the employees and what they liked, what they didn't like, and then you just continue to build on it. And the only other thing I would say too is, because we have so many affinity groups at Owens Corning, I think one thing that we're starting to do and be very deliberate about is coordinating across our affinity groups, because you could get very caught up in, you know, AARG having an event today and then outreach an event tomorrow and win an event tomorrow. And then employees are like, I can't attend all of these. So we've started to become very focused around having like a big signature event each year, and then maybe some supplemental things each quarter, but making sure that, you know, for instance, AARG is, you know, they get the month of February because that's Black History Month, you know, and so just being deliberate about how you're planning some of those events out, so that it coincides with things that we recognize, you know, as a whole.
Well, thank you very much, panel. We really appreciate it. Was there any final comments? Because you guys were great. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I just want to throw one more comment in there, and this really kind of ties in with what Scott and Jana just shared. But in terms of pitfalls, I would just say, don't get frustrated, stay the course, because it is a journey. And I think all of us, as we work with our affinity groups, have gone through those moments where, hey, we only had a few people show up for our event, or we're not getting the progress or participation that we all want. And you know, I just say, stay with it. We're not where we want to be yet, but we're moving forward, and that's the important thing.
Well said. Jeff, it's back into your hands.
Awesome. This was really great. This is knowing a little bit about what you guys have done with the ARGs. This was so much more than I thought I would learn. So this has been really great. I think the key here that a lot of our smaller members need to realize is you don't have to be 400 or 500 members in a group. It can be 3 or 4 people, and you can still make an impact within your organization. And I love like what Scott's talking about, that you're partnering with other organizations in the community, because I feel we're a big community, but we're small enough that we may not have a leader in certain aspects across the community. So it's great to hear that you're forming alliances across the board, so that if someone is looking for some expertise, they can tap into that. So again, I just want to thank everybody for today. This was probably the one that I looked the most forward to this week, and it did not let me down whatsoever. I hope that everyone else on the phone got a lot out of this, and I can't wait to share it with some more people. So again, thank you, Clyde, Scott, Jana, Houston, Matt, thanks for helping coordinate, and Leah as well. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Buckeye Broadband, Associated General Contractors of Northwest Ohio, and Lucas County Department of Planning and Development. And look for our newsletter in the next few days, so that we can, we'll have all of this great information out there, and we'll have even more. Again, thanks a lot so much. And if anyone has questions, we'll make sure that we pass along your guys' contact information. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone.
All right.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
everyone.
Thank you, team.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.